Muted, but I could hear some background noise going on there. So if you wouldn't mind just making sure that you, excuse me, that you are muted. So this week I'm going to be talking about, as you can see there, IRA intelligence operations 1918 to 1921. I'm going to be also making liberal use of the statements, the Bureau of Military History witness statements made in the 1940s and 1950s by a number of those involved in the intelligence war. Obviously, one who didn't, the man whose photograph is featured there, Michael Collins. He wasn't around, obviously, to do so. Now, the archetypal Irish rebellion, of course, as we all know, was always brought down by one or more embedded spies or performers. Sorry, not performers, informers, excuse me. The United Irishmen, for example, in 1798 were betrayed by, amongst others, one of their leading members, Leonard McNally, who was a barrister, who actually continued to supply information to Dublin Castle for 20 years after that rebellion, and even represented the young rebel Robert Emmet in his treason trial after his abortive and ill-fated 1803 rebellion, the last gasp of the United Irishmen, and was supplying the British colonial administration with information even then. In 1865, the Fenians were stymied 2 years before their rebellion by information supplied to the castle by a man called Pierce Nagle, who worked on the IRB newspaper, The Irish People. Sorry, there's somebody, if you could all mute, make sure that you're all muted, because I can hear some background noise coming across, if you wouldn't mind. In 1916 then, on the other hand, the inadequacy of Dublin Castle's intelligence sources was shown up when they were totally taken by surprise by the Easter Rising on the 24th of April, despite naval intelligence knowing about the mission of the Oud from Germany in advance of its arrival. And that's one of the things that makes the 1919 to 21 period a revolution rather than a mere rebellion, because it certainly wasn't revolutionary based on any social change that it brought about. Political change, yes. Societal or social change, no. The War of Independence was a very conservative revolution. One of the factors that made it revolutionary was the level of organization, attention to detail, and sheer ruthlessness of the IRA intelligence operation. Propaganda, alternative Sinn Féin courts, a functioning parallel local administration, the guerrilla campaign, obviously, of the IRA, all of these contributed to the establishment of an independent Irish Free State in 1922. Arguably, however, that success would not have been possible were it not for the efficiency of the intelligence infrastructure put in place primarily by one of the great innovators of the Anglo-Irish conflict, the young finance minister and IRA Director of Intelligence and Professional Corkman, Michael Collins, 28 years of age when the shooting war began on the 21st of January 1919. Now, I'm hoping to avoid in this talk culpably or completely over-egging the importance of Collins in the intelligence war. He was undoubtedly the primary player on the Republican side, but he was not omnipotent, and he was not infallible. He did make mistakes. Collins was already establishing an informal spy network as early as 1917, 1918. And by 1919, he already had in place the core of the active service unit that would become known as the Squad, or because of their number, there were 12 of them, they were known as the 12 Apostles, and they included at various times some of the men in this is photographed: Mick McDonnell, Vinnie Byrne, and Paddy Daly, for example, Jim Slattery. These were, however, these weren't intelligence operators as such. These were, in essence, his enforcers. These are his assassins. Eventually, they would become full-time counter-espionage agents and assassins, and would be paid the princely sum of £4.10 a week, which was a decent wage in those days. In September 1919, then, the cabinet, in the form of the defense minister, Cathal Brugha, gave its approval for the formal establishment of an intelligence unit or department attached to general headquarters. On the level of the IRA itself, over which Brugha would theoretically at least have exercised control, every battalion had its own intelligence officer, and these reported to brigade intelligence officers. Later on, when divisions were created in 1921, they reported to divisional intelligence officers. Some of these IOs were highly effective, others were far less so. But Collins demanded that information from these sources was to be passed up the line to his own GHQ intelligence unit, which was based in 3 Crow Street in Dublin, which was a short hop from the main telephone exchange in the city, and also a very short hop from Dublin Castle itself. And Collins's task in this regard was made easier by the proliferation in positions of authority in the IRA of members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the secret oath-bound organization founded in 1858 and responsible for the organization of the 1916 Rising, for example, of which he was now effective leader. Cathal Brugha was not a fan of the IRB, and for that matter, he wasn't a great fan of Michael Collins. And one of Collins's first and most important coups was recruiting a Dublin Metropolitan Police Sergeant, Ned Broy, Eamon Broy, to work for him. Now, Broy was no ordinary policeman. He worked in the offices of G Division in Great Brunswick Street, now Pearse Street. It's actually Pearse Street Garda Station, opposite the side entrance to Trinity College. The city of Dublin at the time, for policing purposes, was divided into 6 divisions, A to F, and G Division was the 7th division, and it was an overarching division. It was a detective unit, largely responsible for political crime, which was headquartered in Brunswick, Great Brunswick Street. Now, Broy had joined the Dublin Metropolitan Police as a young man in 1911. He was a keen athlete and they had a good athletics program. And he worked with the rank of detective sergeant, largely as a clerk, typing reams of confidential material and reports. Now, obviously, that gave him access to an extraordinarily high level of confidential information for somebody who was a relatively low-level officer. In his witness statement, he recorded that daily reports were made to the government as regards the activities and movements of suspects, note being taken of those with whom they associated. In addition, weekly reports were made to the government, giving the history of the week's activities and a general review of the state of the complete political activity in the district. There was also a monthly report on similar lines. Before my time, the reports were in handwriting. But when I took over the office, the majority were typed by me, several copies being made of each report. Except he didn't tell them about the unofficial copy, where he would slip in an extra carbon and make a copy for Michael Collins. When he was introduced in 1918 to Collins, Broy had made one proviso for his cooperation, for his involvement as a spy, and that was that there were to be no IRA attacks, intelligence attacks on uniformed DMP officers who, unlike their RIC counterparts, had no political duties. The RIC was very much a paramilitary force, and local RIC men were, whether they liked it or not, involved in some shape or form in intelligence operations. That was not the case with the uniformed DMP. Now, also in his statement, he wrote, or he said to his interviewer, the majority, at least, of the younger DMP men were anti-British and had many relatives in the volunteers. They were quite different from the RIC, all of whom had to do political duty owing to the manner in which they were distributed in small stations through the country. We decided that it was necessary to melt down the RIC. This is why the RIC individual members in uniform became targets in a way that the DMP uniformed officers did not. And Broy's injunction against the killing of uniformed DMP officers was largely observed by Collins's agents. For example, even in the case of one of Broy's own plainclothes G Division colleagues, a detective called Dennis O'Brien, the ultimate sanction of murder was not exercised in his case. Broy records that Detective Officer Dennis O'Brien was the first member of the section to be dealt with. He was tied to a railing. O'Brien had been more than usually active, observing and shadowing volunteers and Sinn Féiners. O'Brien was warned during the tying up that if he continued on the same lines, there would be no mercy shown to him the next time. He said to some of us afterwards, they were damn decent men not to shoot me, and I'm not doing any more work against them. 12 plainclothes DMP officers lost their lives in Dublin from 1919 to 21 out of a total of about 300 people killed in the capital city during the War of Independence. All but one of those were G Division detectives killed by agents of Collins between July 1919 and April 1920. And on the 7th of April, Collins indulged himself in and implicated Broy in, this is in 1919, an escapade that topped anything else that Collins did in a 2-year career as director of intelligence and in a 2.5-year career of avoiding being captured, of cycling around Dublin in plain sight, for example. But this was an escapade out of all proportion to anything else he did. He persuaded Broy to admit him to the records section of G Division on the first floor of the Brunswick Street office. So he basically presented himself late that night. And again, Broy records, Michael stayed from about 12:25 till about 5 a.m. There were many reasons for his visit. He wanted to know the background of what he called the correspondence, which they had received from me, the exact degree of British knowledge as regards the Volunteers, Sinn Féin, and other national organizations. Michael wanted to ascertain who of his people were known, and still more important, were not known. He wanted to try and gauge the mentality behind the records, and then to use the police secret organization as a model with suitable improvements and modifications for volunteer requirements. Not very long afterwards, the books were taken to the castle, so he got there just in time. He also managed to read his own record, in which he was described as being quite clever. I think words to that effect, something like that. Now, Broy continued to work for Collins unscathed until a few months before the truce in July 1921. He was finally caught when a raid on a Sinn Féin premises in Dublin resulted in the capture of a number of documents. And one of these, a document which should have been destroyed by the IRA a long time before, could only have come from Broy's office and had been typed either by Broy or a colleague, a former DMP man, a man named Sergeant McCarthy. And Broy was jailed on suspicion and threatened with a court-martial. And the case against Broy, of course, hinged on the evidence of Sergeant McCarthy. Now, fortunately for Broy, McCarthy, as it happened, was a Sinn Féin sympathiser who had resigned from the Dublin Metropolitan Police because of his Sinn Féin sympathies. And he was now working in London. And Collins got to McCarthy before the authorities managed to get to him, and instructed McCarthy to go into hiding and to get ready to sail for the USA. And when McCarthy was visited by Scotland Yard detectives shortly afterwards and told to get ready to return to Dublin to testify against Broy, he managed to get away from them. And he was hidden for 2 weeks by IRA sympathisers in England. And he was then brought to Liverpool and he was put on a boat to New York. And once McCarthy was safely in the USA, Broy's lawyer, a man called Michael Noyack, who took a lot of Sinn Féin. Sorry, could you mute your? We're having a problem with people not muting their microphones. Thanks very much. You're breaking through. Once McCarthy was safely in the USA, Broy's lawyer pressed for the authorities for a court-martial to begin. He'd been stalling up to that point, and Dublin Castle. Then they started to stall. They played for time, knowing that they had lost a crucial witness. And furthermore, they knew that McCarthy's flight suggested guilt, and it would be more difficult to convict Broy. And then to cast even more doubt on Broy's guilt and to make the castle authorities actually believe that he was innocent, he might be innocent. Collins adopted a pretty transparent and simplistic ruse, but one that seems to have worked. Again, Broy records, about this time, Collins had a message written and initialed by himself, accidentally dropped in the castle. It was addressed to a mythical numbered agent in the castle, requesting an immediate report as to who this Broy was that was a prisoner in Arbour Hill, and stating that volunteer headquarters understood he was hostile to Sinn Féin and that they knew nothing as to why he was in Arbour Hill. As it happens, Broy survived the War of Independence, although during his period in detention, there were times when he was pretty certain that he was about to be executed or murdered out of hand or disappeared. And it was the negotiation of the truce in July 1921 that may well have saved Broy from execution or being disappeared. He was released at the insistence of Collins when the truce came into effect. And later he accompanied Collins to London as, in effect, his bodyguard during the treaty negotiations. Now, Collins also enlisted the aid of two other DMP men, Joe Cavan and James McNamara, but his ace inside Dublin Castle itself was DMP Detective Constable David Nelligan, the so-called spy in the castle. And disillusioned by British policy in Ireland after 1916, Nelligan had actually offered his services to the IRA as an alternative to resigning from the force. Collins wasn't told about this approach or about this offer. Okay. Am I? Can you hear me? Did you miss that? Some of that? A just message came up to say that for some reason I had been muted.
Okay, now I think.
Okay, Grant. Okay, thanks, Helen. So Collins wasn't told about Nelligan's approach, and no one took Nelligan up on the offer. Nelligan resigned and returned to Kerry. Later, Collins found out about what had happened, and he managed to prevail on Nelligan to rejoin the DMP. And to add to the credibility of his reapplication or his application to re-enlist, the IRA arranged for threatening letters to be sent to him, warning him to get out of Kerry. So that added credibility to his attempt to re-enlist. Nelligan made himself useful to Collins in a variety of ways. But this is his own statement. Every G-man kept a journal in which he entered the names of political suspects he had seen that day and other relevant data in connection with his work of watching the revolutionaries. McNamara or myself examined these diaries every night, where they were kept in a room in the castle, and took all the details from them. We used to convey this information to Collins, which served as a warning to those political suspects to watch themselves, that they were being seen by the police or under observation with a view to being picked up later. Now, one of the squad's most spectacular hits in 1920 was the killing of the newly appointed head of G Division, the RIC District Inspector, a man called William Redmond, who was brought down from Belfast to stiffen the resolve of the city's political police. And in his witness statement, Nelligan sketches in the intelligence background to the killing of Redmond, one that indirectly led to subsequent murders. Redmond told the assembled G-men one night, including myself, that it was very strange they could not catch Michael Collins, because a man who was only over from England a couple of days had met him several times. Collins, on hearing this from McNamara, knew that this man over from England was a fellow named Burns or Jemison, who was pretending to be anxious to help the revolution in Ireland. Redmond was afterwards shot in Harcourt Street by the volunteers, Collins saying, if we don't get him, he'll get us. Burns, after being warned by Collins, persisted and was shot in Glasnevin. Nelligan or McNamara, as you can see, had no compunction whatever when it came to supplying information that was likely to lead to the murder of DMP colleagues or British agents. Burns in question is probably better known as Jemison. Burns was his real name. That's not how it's spelled. It's spelled B-Y-R-N-E-S. And he was a British agent who got quite close, dangerously close to Collins. But that piece of information certainly helped them to identify him as a spy. So also in March 1920, the squad murdered an apparently innocuous figure, a resident magistrate, a non-military accounting officer, basically, named Alan Bell. But Nelligan was responsible for this because Nelligan was aware of Bell's activities and that Bell's activities posed a direct threat to Collins in his role as Dáil's Minister for Finance. Collins, said Nelligan, had Sinn Féin funds banked in various banks under the names of private, respectable individuals, that is, non-political citizens. It was to these accounts and to the worming out of such secret nest eggs that Bell set himself. His death was urgently necessary, merely as a defense measure and a warning to others. And based on information supplied by David Nelligan and a lot of legwork undertaken by members of the squad, Bell was taken off a tram in broad daylight on his way to work without a bodyguard or escort of any kind, which I still find absolutely mind-boggling, and murdered in the street near the RDS in Bowles Bridge. Unlike Broy, however, Nelligan continued to work completely undetected by the intelligence agents of the Crown. He was even enlisted into the British Secret Service. Can you imagine what kind of a coup that was like for Collins? Made him incredibly valuable to Collins at that stage. And after the truce, Nelligan received a letter from the British authorities thanking him for his, quote, magnificent services to Ireland, unquote. Now, obviously, not a word of a lie there, but perhaps not exactly as they meant. Nelligan, post-war of independence, actually drew a pension. He had the crust to draw a pension from the Dublin Metropolitan Police and MI5, the British Secret Service. Why not? He'd earned it, let's face it. Collins created a highly efficient network of spies, but they weren't all male. One of his best agents was Lily Mernon, who was the cousin of the IRA propagandist Pierce Beasley, but that's the person she's photographed with there. And she was known to Collins in any very, very rare correspondence, because Collins did not commit an awful lot to paper, as the little gentleman or Lieutenant G, to put people off. She was employed as a typist in the Dublin District Garrison Adjutant's office in the Lower Castle Yard. And she proved extremely useful to Collins when it came to the identification of the Dublin accommodation of British agents. And that information was to prove crucial to the assassinations on Bloody Sunday, 21st of November, 1920, which I'll talk about later. And she puts it herself very succinctly in her witness statement. Before the 21st of November, 1920, it was part of my normal duty to type the names and addresses of British agents who were accommodated at private addresses and living as ordinary citizens in the city. These lists were typed weekly and amended whenever an address was changed. I passed them on each week, either to the address at Moynihan's Clonliffe Road or to Pierce Beasley. The typing of the lists ceased after the 21st of November, 1920. What a surprise. And Mernon's gender was also exploited by the IRA in a vaguely Irish version of the classic espionage stratagem, the so-called honey trap. The auxiliaries, she recorded, organised smoking concerts and whist drives in the Lower Castle Yard. I was encouraged by Frank Soren, a member of the intelligence squad, to give all the assistance I could in the organisation of these whist drives for the sole purpose of getting to know the auxiliaries and finding out all I possibly could about them. Frank Soren had arranged with me that should any of the auxiliaries see myself or any of the girls of the castle home, he would have members of his squad hanging around Dublin Castle to identify them. However, the auxiliaries never did come past the castle gate. These would have been auxiliaries in F Company of the RIC auxiliary. Now, in reality, the writ of Collins did not really run far beyond Dublin. Communicating intelligence from far-flung parts of the country was dangerous, and networks in some areas were dependent on the abilities and the enthusiasm of local IOs, local intelligence officers. And this meant that local IOs had a great deal of independence. And one of the most important of these was based in Collins's home county of Cork, the city of Cork, in actual fact. Because Michael Collins had his equivalent in Cork in the shape of Florence O'Donoghue, who was a Kerryman, who was head of intelligence for the Cork No. 1 Brigade. This is a biography of Florence O'Donoghue and his wife by my very good friend, John Borgonovo. O'Donoghue, like Collins, was an IRB man, sworn in 1917, and he was only in his mid-20s when the War of Independence began, but that meant nothing. I mean, he was actually only 3 years younger than Collins. And O'Donoghue's variation on the Dublin intelligence coup that was Bloody Sunday was the killing, also in November 1920, but over an extended period, of 6 British Army officers and 5 civilians, all involved in spying. And he ran a number of agents, and the most effective of these was Josephine Brown. a British woman who, Florrie O'Donoghue, later married. She had been married previously, and O'Donoghue was also instrumental in kidnapping her son from her late husband's family in Wales. Her husband had been killed in World War I, and his grandparents had hung on to him, and Florrie O'Donoghue organised the kidnapping of the child who would later become his stepson. Brown went to work in early 1917 as a clerk and typist at the Cork military barracks. And in late 1919, managed to contact officers of the Cork Brigade of the IRA and offer her services. And from then until the truce, she collected and transmitted original documents, copies of documents, and information relating to British personnel, equipment, and troop movements. She was invaluable and took incredible risks. She had access to lots and lots of valuable information, which included, for example, the correspondence of Major General Sir Peter Strickland, who was the officer commanding the 6th Division and who was the military governor of the Munster Martial Law District. So she saw everything that went across Strickland's desk. And in order, I love this little wrinkle, this little twist, in order to enhance her intelligence gathering operation, Josephine Brown, later Josephine O'Donoghue, actually contrived to have 3 other women who were working in the barracks sacked for unreliability. And this gave her access to a far greater amount of confidential information. It meant she had to work harder, but it also meant that she had much more access. And she was well aware of the use to which much of this information was being put. This is, she didn't give a witness statement, but she did apply for a pension. This is from her military service pension application file. Under the direction of the brigade officers, I paid special attention to scouring information with regard to the personnel and movements of the British intelligence staff attached to the 6th Division and transmitted a list of the officers of this staff. As a result of information given by me concerning the movements of members of this staff, 3 British intelligence officers were captured by the IRA at Waterfall near Cork. These officers were wearing civilian clothes and were subsequently executed. I secured information in several cases where civilians had sent in information relating to the IRA. 6 civilians were executed by the IRA as a result. So, you know, she knew exactly what she was doing. As did all Collins's intelligence agents. Undoubtedly, well, sorry, she was not Collins's intelligence agent. She was Florence O'Donoghue's intelligence agent. Undoubtedly, the most startling and morale-sapping event for British intelligence during the Anglo-Irish War was the spectacular series of assassinations planned and executed by Collins, the squad, and also elements of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA in November 1920. The squad would never been able to do it on their own. And that was the killings of a dozen or so men pinpointed as British agents, although this has always been disputed. Some are claimed to have been misidentified as British agents. That took place in a series of coordinated raids designed to happen at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 21st of November 1920. Some of the raids were unsuccessful, but most were carried out with ruthless and bloody efficiency. And the background to this coup was an increase in intelligence and counterintelligence activities on the part of Dublin Castle. And this was exemplified by the activities of F Company, of the RIC Auxiliary Force based in Dublin Castle, and used primarily in countering the activities of the squad and in attempting to ferret out agents in the British administration who were supplying Collins with information. And one of the most notorious members of this company, of F Company, was Major Jocelyn Lee Hardy, nicknamed Hoppy Hardy because of his limp. He lost a leg in World War I, from which he emerged with Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order. And Harvey's specialty, you know, he looks slightly angelic, looks very young and angelic. He wasn't. His specialty was brutal interrogation of IRA suspects. And he was loathed by Republicans. He was infamous in Republican circles, and he was one of the main targets of the squad. However, he rarely, if ever, left Dublin Castle, except in the company of well-armed members of F Company and generally in a crossly tender. Another major factor in the beefing up of British intelligence activities was the arrival in Dublin of this guy here, Brigadier General Sir Ormond Winter, as the new Dublin Castle Chief of Intelligence. And Winter was described in the diaries of one of the top civil servants, British civil servants at Dublin Castle, Mark Sturgis, in the following terms: "He looks like a wicked little white snake, is as clever as paint, probably entirely non-moral, a first-class horseman, a card genius, knows several languages, is a super sleuth, and is a most amazing original." He wrote an autobiography in 1955 called A Winter's Tale. See what he did there? And he claimed in that autobiography, completely over the top, to have personally killed one potential assassin, to have fought his way out of an IRA ambush, capturing one of the ambushers in the process, and to have been bitterly disappointed that the price that Michael Collins put on his head was only £1,000. The reward for Collins himself was 10,000 quid. But let's face it, the Crown had greater resources than the IRA. Winter was known to all and sundry as Ormond Winter O, and he brought an enhanced level of professionalism to the British operation in Dublin Castle. He recruited a number of agents from Britain, some of whom achieved a moderate level of success. One of those was Jamison Burns. And by the way, I think it's important not to underestimate the capabilities of British intelligence during the War of Independence. You know, we tend to think of it as a one-way street. It wasn't. After all, I mean, the long-standing intelligence resources of the RIC, G Division of the DMP, were at the disposal of Dublin Castle. Outside Dublin, the authorities, the RIC, the TANs, the OGSIs, and the military had considerable success in identifying and incarcerating IRA volunteers and officers. And even in Dublin, despite the direct administration of Collins, they had successes there as well. The very fact of the frequent executions by the IRA in Dublin and in Cork in particular of suspected spies and informers offers a clear illustration of the vigorous attempts at infiltration by the British authorities. The same thing happened in my own county, in County Meath, where more men were executed, murdered by the IRA than there were fatalities, military fatalities on both sides in the War of Independence. Because there was infiltration of the Meath IRA. There was no doubt about it, and they were trying to worm out the spy or spies. Anyway, so you know, as I say, it wasn't all a one-way street. At a political level, the context of the coup of the 21st of November 1920 was the rising confidence of the British administration that by the second half of 1920, the IRA was on the run, was almost defeated. And these sentiments were encouraged by the likes of Ormond Winter, who was feeding his boss, Sir Basil Thompson, who in turn was feeding the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Sir Hamer Greenwood. And there was at least some justification for this belief. In late 1920, for example, three of the most significant IRA intelligence officers, second in command to Collins, Liam Tobin, and his close associates, Tom Cullen and Frank Thornton, were arrested and interrogated by Winter's agents. And without sufficient evidence to detain them, they were let go. Now, I find that interesting because it should be pointed out, I think, that in any conflict where the rule of law was of absolutely no relevance, all three of them would simply have disappeared. Despite the frequent ugliness of British policies in Ireland during this period, and by God, some of them were ugly, the rule of law was never completely abandoned. Had it been Tom Cullen, Frank Thornton, Liam Tobin would never have emerged from Dublin Castle, as we'll see, excuse me, McGee, Dick McKee and Peadar Clune and Clancy did not emerge, but that's I'll come to that. The overconfidence of Dublin Castle that the IRA was a spent force, pummeled by the newly arrived Black and Tans and Ogsies recruited mainly from Britain to supplement the failing RIC, led to what was retrospectively a very inadvisable assertion by Prime Minister Lloyd George on the 9th of November 1920. He gave a speech in, I think it was the Guildhall in London, that quote, in which he said, "We have murder by the throat in Ireland." And he got his answer within a fortnight. The operation of the 21st of November was planned by Collins, was planned by Tobin, by Cullen, and by Thornton. So you can see if their arrests had stuck, we might not have had the morning of Bloody Sunday. Also involved was the Dublin Brigade IRA leadership, including Dick McKee, Peadar Clancy, and Oscar Traynor. And the killings were carried out by elements of the Dublin Brigade, and among others, one of the squad's leading assassins, Vinnie Byrne, a younger member involved was future Irish Taoiseach, Sean Lemass. Another very young member, not involved in any of the killing, but as an intelligence officer, was Charlie Dalton, Emmett Dalton's younger brother. Now, initially, Collins had targeted up to 50 alleged British agents, but on the insistence of Cathal Brugha, the list of targets was reduced to 15. Brugha found all of this a little bit unseemly and, kind of un-British almost. It wasn't cricket, as if they were playing by cricket rules. And the list of targets was reduced by 15. So there were 35 targets altogether. One of the most infamous members of the squad, Vinnie Byrne, was involved in the successful attempt to kill two British officers, Ames and Bennett, at 38 Mount Street in Dublin. And his account of what happened is typical of his Bureau of Military History witness statement, which is bloodthirsty in the extreme. When we came to number 38, I detailed 4 or 5 men to keep guard outside. I mean, he looks like a choir boy, doesn't he? I then went to the hall door along with Tom Ennis and rang the bell. The servant girl opened the door. I asked her, could I see Lieutenant Bennett or Lieutenant Ames? At the same time, jamming the door with my foot. As I entered the hall, I beckoned to the remainder of my men to follow. When inside, I asked the girl, where did the 2 officers sleep? As I opened the folding doors, the officer, who was in bed, was in the act of going for his gun under his pillow. Doyle and myself dashed into the room, at the same time ordering him to put up his hands, which he did. Doyle dashed around by the side of the bed and pulled a Colt 45 from beneath the pillow. I marched my officer down to the back room where the other officer was. He was standing up on the bed facing the wall. I ordered mine to do likewise. When the 2 of them were together, I said to myself, the Lord have mercy on their souls. I then opened fire with my Peter, that's a Peter the Painter revolver. They both fell dead. So that's Vinnie Byrne's account. Another 19, altogether 19 men were shot. 15 died, 14 on the day, one of his wounds later. Of the 15, not all were members, certainly were not all members of Winter's intelligence team. A couple were army officers. One was an alleged civilian informant, and 2 appeared to have been innocent civilians, including a landlord in one case. Only one IRA man involved in the operation was captured, and he later escaped from prison. 2 more, Patrick Moran and Thomas Whelan, were later arrested, and despite witness alibis placing them elsewhere on the 21st of November, they were executed in March 1921 in connection with the murder. So they were the only IRA men who paid for their lives for the Bloody Sunday killings. Obviously, it also coincided with the murder of 14 civilians at Croke Park later that afternoon, and the murder in custody of the captured Dublin Brigade commandants Dick McKee and Peadar Clancy, and the entirely innocent and unfortunate Gaelic League member Peadar Clune, who was in I think it was the Talbot Hotel at the same time it was lifted. They were shot trying to escape. And anyway, all of these killings made it the bloodiest single day in the history of the Anglo-Irish War, 32 deaths in one day. Had more of the raids been successful on the morning of the 21st of November, the casualty list would have been even higher. A number of attempted killings were abortive in some instances because alleged agents were not at the addresses provided. In others, because the would-be assassins were not very efficient or basically chickened out in some cases. Hoppy Hardy was among those fortunate enough not to be at his given address that day, but his usual address was Dublin Castle anyway. Whatever the actual activities of the men who were murdered by the squad of the Dublin IRA on that day, and as I say, it's been argued that as few as 6 of the 14 were actually involved in British intelligence in Ireland. The operation was still a huge psychological blow for Dublin Castle and for its war against the IRA, coupled then, of course, with the Kilmichael ambush a week later, in which the West Cork IRA killed 17 auxiliaries. It certainly gave the lie Lloyd George's claim that we have murder by the throat in Ireland. From an IRA point of view, however, while the operation on the morning of Bloody Sunday damaged British intelligence operations, it didn't end them. The recruitment of British secret operatives, who were rather easily identifiable in Dublin from their accents alone, and often coming to the attention of Collins' network of informants, who included waiters, waitresses, barmen, etc. They gave way in part to the creation of a different threat, a new threat, in the form of something called the Igo Gang. Now, we don't know whether this is the Igo Gang or not, or something called the Cairo Gang, which probably never existed. The Cairo Gang it was a name ascribed subsequently to some of the men who were shot and killed on Bloody Sunday because they apparently hung out in the Cairo cafe. But it's probably the case that the Cairo Gang as such did not exist. Anyway, so this may or may not be a photograph of the Igo Gang. The Igo Gang was a domestic espionage force or counter-espionage force consisting of RIC retreads. It was led by Galway RIC detective Eugene Igo. And the Igo Gang included RIC detectives from the most active parts of the country. And they were then just deployed on the streets of Dublin, particularly the railway stations. And their job was to identify, arrest, and interrogate known IRA men. And they were highly visible. They could be seen walking in twos and threes around the city of Dublin, keeping their eyes peeled for, Sean Tracy, for example, who, came up from Tipperary. And despite their high visibility, and despite the fact that they were targeted by the squad, the IRA never managed to kill Igo or any of his lieutenants. There's a cost in all of this. There's a physical cost. There's a psychological cost. The witness statements, the autobiographies, the media interviews of members of the IRA intelligence cadre around Collins, or members of the squad, for example, convey an impression of dedicated, ruthless, callous spies and assassins. But there was a significant cost for this war in the shadows. For many British agents, it was cost them their lives. But for the men and women working under Michael Collins, many of whom were still teenagers, there was often a belated cost. And included in the massive military service pension collection at the military archives in Carlbrugh Barracks in Rathmines are, for example, a number of examples of this. Take the disability application of a young man called James Paul Norton. Norton was involved in the Bloody Sunday shootings of a British Army officer named McLean and his Irish landlord, Thomas Smith, at 117 Moorhampton Road. And the application, the pension application, is a disability application written not by Norton, but by a medical professional, refers to Norton's participation in the murder of the two men, quote, in front of their screaming wives and children. And the application goes on. The applicant's mental condition showed gradual deterioration during the months following, until complete mental breakdown was reached by July 1921, when the applicant single-handed and without orders got in the middle of a roadway at the Custom House, armed with a revolver, and attempted to capture a tender of British troops, armed and carrying full war equipment. The applicant was then taken prisoner and subsequently sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. And then there's the case of Charles Dalton, whom I mentioned already, a teenage member, not of the squad as such, but he accompanied the squad and, collected files in the rooms of murdered spies. Now, Dalton's own witness statement, he did leave a witness statement, was taken in 1950, and it's cogent, it's clear, and it portrays no frailties of any kind. It's Charlie Dalton, tough guy. However, a decade before, in a disability pension application submitted in May 1940 by his wife, Teresa, we see a very, very different Charlie Dalton indeed. A young man well, he wouldn't have been that young, I suppose, in 1940 anymore, but a man whose War of Independence experience has left him psychologically scarred. It's clear, for example, in a letter from the medical superintendent of St. Patrick's Hospital, dated 3rd of April 1941, that Dalton is dangerously paranoid. He's been an inmate of St. Patrick's since November 1938. And the letter informs the referee in his case, or referees, that Dalton is undergoing treatment for serious form of mental breakdown. Although he has improved somewhat since admission, the outlook in his case is very grave. From the beginning, he's been in a constant state of fear, afraid of being shot, and that he's wanted by the authorities for various crimes. He's acutely hallucinated, hearing voices which accuse him of murder. In my opinion, the nature of Mr. Dalton's delusions and hallucinations clearly point to his experiences in the Irish War as the cause of his mental breakdown. And also included in this absolutely fascinating file, you can access it online, is a letter from future Taoiseach, Sean Lemass. In 1941, when the letter was submitted, Lemass was Minister for Supplies, a crucial role during World War II, or what would have been described or called the emergency. He found time, though, to write a 5-page letter on behalf of Dalton's wife, which offers some clues as to the genesis of the former IRA intelligence officer's psychological difficulties. Now, bear in mind that in 1920, Dalton was 17 years old, and Sean Lemass at the time was all of 21 years of age. Lemass writes, I first became seriously concerned about him on the evening of Sunday, November 21st, 1920, since called Bloody Sunday. On the morning of that day, a number of British government agents in Dublin were shot. It was your husband's job to accompany a party of IRA to one house occupied by 4 of those agents, all of whom were shot. He returned subsequently to the billet at South William Street, and I realized that he had become unnerved by his experiences of the morning. This was a safe house in South William Street. So obvious was his condition that I and one of the others took him out for a walk, although it was an undesirable and a risky thing to do and might have drawn attention to the billet. It did not improve his condition. And during that night, he was on occasions inclined to be hysterical. I recollect that a tap in the dispensary was leaking and making a gurgling noise. This noise apparently reminded your husband of a similar noise he had heard when the 4 men were shot. He shouted to us several times to stop the noise of the tap, and it was with difficulty that he was quietened. At this period, your husband was very young, and his experiences could not but have left a permanent mark on him. I recollect speaking to some of his senior officers subsequently and urging that he should get a rest or a transfer to another area. And fellow intelligence officer Frank Soren described Dalton years later, after the end of the War of Independence. He became obsessed with the idea that his house was surrounded by men out to get him. He bolted and locked all his doors and went as far as to climb the stairs on his hands and knees, thereby avoiding throwing his shadow on a drawn blind so that he would not present a target to his imaginary potential executioners. When he subsequently was placed in a nursing home, a friend and I were obliged to stand outside armed in his view. He had to be shown the guns for the purpose of dealing with the same imaginary enemies. Now, in Dalton's case, some of his paranoia would have emanated from the Civil War and what he was involved in during the Civil War. And that is also true of Liam Tobin, who was second in command. He wasn't just a grunt. He was second in command to Collins. And his granddaughter happens to be one of my best friends. And her brother, Brian Hand, is the family historian. And I interviewed Brian for a radio series on the War of Independence that we did for the History Show. And he told me about the toll that Tobin's association with Collins had taken. For years after the Anglo-Irish War, Tobin was convinced that he would be murdered in revenge for his intelligence activities from 1919 to 23, including his Civil War service. And he looked 10 years older, according to Brian, than his contemporaries. He had difficulty sleeping. He suffered from a very nervous disposition. He refused to drive a car for fear of being more vulnerable to attack. And he slept until quite late in life. He died in 1963 with a gun under his pillow. And on one occasion, as a prank, Brian's mother, then 10 years old, ran into her father's room and told him excitedly that De Valera had been shot. And he went as white as a sheet and began to shake, physically shake in front of his daughter. And she realized later that he probably assumed that he would be next. Now, in conclusion, no less an authority than the CIA itself in an assessment of the IRA intelligence operation released to the public only as recently as 1994 asserted of the Irish War of Independence intelligence war, it seems clear that the British plan to destroy the Irish service failed. By acting first, the Irish intelligence service had delivered the coup de main to the British intelligence network in Dublin. Now, it's a somewhat oversimplistic assessment. The British intelligence operation against the IRA was never as unsuccessful as the CIA makes it sound. Presumably, they were just trying to get up the noses of MI5 and or MI6 by making this assessment. Collins was very conscious of the debilitating history of spies and informers in Irish rebellions, and he told a journalist who was also his biographer, Hayden Talbot, in 1922, for example, that the English Secret Service in Ireland for centuries had broken every movement ever attempted by Irishmen to make Ireland an independent nation. The espionage staff of the British forces of control in Ireland, operating from their headquarters in Dublin Castle, was a body to which England had every right to point with pride. Now the time had come to turn our attention to the most important part of our job, the smashing of the English Secret Service. The way to do this was obvious, and it fell naturally into two main parts, making it unhealthy for Irishmen to betray their fellows and making it deadly for Englishmen to exploit them. So, in conclusion, what were the keys to the success of Michael Collins's intelligence operation? Well, one was bureaucratic efficiency, residing in the personality of Collins himself. Collins kept much of the espionage information gleaned by his agents in his head. He had an incredible capacity. He wasn't going to write all this stuff down, but he incredible capacity for names, faces, and facts. Inspiring leadership, again, residing in the personality of Collins. I always ask myself the question, and ask the question in general, would the likes of Ned Broy and David Nelligan have taken as many risks for Cathal Brugha, who was a very dour defense minister? I don't think they would. I think it was the charisma of Collins that inspired them. Sheer bravado. He seemed to court capture. And then, of course, by doing that and by consistently evading arrest, he added to his mystique and his kudos. And it seemed to the people around him that he had a charmed life. So if he had a charmed life, perhaps they did too. And then finally, utter ruthlessness. He gave no quarter to the enemies of the IRA and demanded just as many sacrifices from his operatives as he did of himself. So while the Black and Tans, the Ogsies, and the British Army operated in Ireland with a level of efficiency that would arguably have crushed any rebellion that did not command the level of public support in evidence in Ireland from 1919 to 21, the same cannot be said of Britain's intelligence operations in Ireland. The IRA GHQ intelligence unit, backed up by IOs in crucially important local brigades around the country, especially in Cork, especially Florence O'Donoghue, more than neutralized the impact of British secret agents, spies, and informers. And the ghosts of Leonard McNally and Pierce Nagel were exorcised completely by Michael Collins, Liam Tobin, Tom Cullen, Frank Thornton, Frank Soran, and others in the rebellion that finally achieved what so many others had failed to do since the last days, excuse me, of the 18th century. Right, that is me done. If anybody has any questions, or Helen, if there's anything coming in on chat.
Yeah, on the chat. Well, I was just going to ask myself actually if there's anything about, say, Josephine O'Donoghue and women like her, any regrets on their part? Have you?
No. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about O'Donoghue's pension application. Now, pension applications tend to be bloody. You're looking for a pension, and you are trying to prove that you were as active as anybody else, and therefore, for example, I have mentioned it, I'm sure. I have a book coming out in May and it involves killings in which members of my family were either victims or were the perpetrators. And in one case, a granduncle of mine was involved in the execution. It was in the firing squad of a young informer in County Meath. And it's very interesting because in his file, there is a reference to the fact that his best chance of getting a pension was to play up the fact that he had actually shot, in cold blood, an unarmed man, albeit somebody who was an informer. So they do tend to kind of play up the I have no regrets. And, there's no evidence that, certainly Vinnie Byrne interviewed years afterwards. Now, absolutely no regrets, whatever. It was kill or be killed. I did what I was asked to do. I did what was expected of me, etc., etc. And I think, Lily Merlin, I'm not aware that she had any regrets. She knew exactly what she was doing. And, I think she loathed the people that she was working with. And, if you're in Dublin Castle, you're watching Hoppy Hardy, you're watching, F Company of the Auxiliaries, what happened to Dick McKee and what happened to Father Clancy. It would be very hard not to loathe them. It would be very hard to care that much about what happened to them, and I'm certainly, Josephine Brown stroke Josephine O'Donoghue was, as far as I'm aware anyway, John, good old John Borgonova would know more, hell of a lot more about it than I would. But I'm not aware that there were any regrets on her part, even though she was British. She didn't even have the excuse that she was Irish.
There's just one question here in the chat. Fantastic talk. Have you come across the new book called The Robinstown Affair by Jim O'Leary? Yeah,
it's actually called, believe it or not, I don't know why, in Meath it's called Robinstown. But there you go. Jim, I was giving a series of talks through Meath libraries on this subject, and Jim was somebody who regularly tuned in. It was over a period of 6 weeks. And I haven't been able to get hold of a copy of the book yet because I can't go more than 5 kilometers outside my bailiwick, and it's a self-published book. So Jim will have a certain amount of difficulty distributing copies of it. But I hear very, very good reports of it. And Jim, Jim is somebody that I would know from radio. Jim's an economist, and Jim is somebody I would have interviewed many, many times, and great expertise. And the book is actually about an Auxie raid, and it's about the period where Percy Crozier, who was the commanding officer of the auxiliaries, actually resigns because of the ill discipline of the Auxies. And the raid was on a family called the Chandlers, and the Chandlers would have been seen locally as being very supportive of unionist causes. And one of the Chandlers ended up in jail, and there was a follow-on from that because shortly after, a strange character arrived in Navan, calling himself Michael O'Brien, claiming to be from Tipperary, and wanting to meet Sean Boylan. And Sean Boylan was the officer commanding the IRA in County Meath, and went on then to become the officer commanding the 1st Eastern Division. But Sean Boylan was very, very close. Sean Boylan was an IRB man. Sean Boylan was very close. He was senior IRB, very close to Collins. And Collins was a regular visitor. Collins used to come to the Dunboyne area. Boylan made sure that there was very little IRA activity in his own bailiwick, because a lot of senior IRA types came to the Dunboyne area for R&R. Collins would have been one of them. So this guy O'Brien turns up in Navan and goes to a well-known Sinn Féin pub and starts saying, yeah, I was in Mountjoy with Chandler, with one of one of these people who was arrested after this auxiliary raid on the pub in Robinstown. And he starts, I'm Republican sympathizer. I want to meet Sean Boylan and so on and so forth. And the guys in Navan don't buy it. And Michael Hilliard, in actual fact, who goes on to become Fianna Fáil TD and government minister, was Minister for Posts and Telegraphs at the time of the establishment of RTE, was a very young, only about 19 years of age, I think, at the time, but was very senior in the Navan IRA. And he and three colleagues take O'Brien and interrogate him. During the course of the interrogation, the accent slips and a Scottish accent is revealed. And in the unredacted version of Michael Hilliard's Bureau of Military History witness statement, there is an account of his execution in the redacted, which is online. In the unredacted, which I have received or got a copy of, you can apply for a copy of it, it becomes clear that Hilliard personally shot him. He shot him in the head. He executed him after interrogating him. Unsanctioned. I mean, these operations were supposed to be sanctioned, although that was more honored in the breach than the observance. But that's a kind of a follow-on from the events that Jim describes in his book.
Fascinating. Apparently, the book can be bought from Jim on Facebook. Just up there. And just one more, Myles, and we leave it at that. I think were the IRA as effective in Belfast? And what would become of Northern Ireland from an intelligence perspective?
No. Belfast was highly problematic and remains so. Belfast and Northern Ireland actually were unique in that the War of Independence effectively continued there during the truce. While the truce was observed in the 26 counties, it wasn't observed in, in Northern Ireland. And you had the problem there that in addition to, the RIC, you also had the northern equivalent of the Tans and Ugsies, basically, which was the A, B, and C Special Constabulary. And, people of my age will remember at the beginning of the Troubles, the so-called B Specials. They were still around at that stage. And they were a kind of an auxiliary force of what then became the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Belfast was highly problematic because you had IRA operations did take place, and there was an IRA, they were the Belfast Brigade and all of this, and battalions within the Belfast Brigade who would have had their own intelligence officers. But it was very, very difficult for them to function. And the violence, I mean, is one of the untold, it's still pretty much an untold story, is in Belfast. I mean, the two biggest cockpits in terms of fatalities of the War of Independence were not Cork and Dublin, they were Cork and Belfast. And I think I would be right in saying that there were more fatalities in Belfast than there were even in Cork, not many more. I think around about 500 in Cork, and I think something like 550 in Belfast. And a lot of those would have been IRA. Some of them would have been security forces, but it was very, very difficult for the IRA to function. And there are a lot of stories of IRA men abandoning Belfast and basically coming south because they were being targeted. They weren't just being chased by the security forces, they were also likely to be turned in by loyalists as well. And then they had the added problem of the Special Constabulary on their backs. So it just became too hot and too heavy. But it was incredibly violent in Belfast over a period of two and a half years or so.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Myles. That was
My
absolutely
pleasure.
fascinating.